Good evening, everyone. Saul K here. Super excited and grateful to be hosting this first of a six-part Zoom series that I've been wanting to offer the community for months. As some of you know, I re-entered UC Berkeley after a long break to go tour the world and put out a bunch of records, and that's a whole other story. But having been on campus over the last, goodness, 7 months now, I've seen a lot of things and I've been surprised by a lot of things. And certainly with the war starting October 7th, when Hamas invaded Israel, I've seen a lot of things on campus that frankly shocked me. And outside of that, I've seen a lack of resources for students on campus as to how to deal with this situation, right? We're living in this new reality that's uncharted waters for most of us, most of our lives. And so I wanted to create a series to do three things. I wanted to give students and their parents a better education on the creation of Israel. I'm actually in the Middle Eastern Language and Culture Department in UC Berkeley, and they did not do the greatest job. So I figured, hey, if this is what's happening inside of the school where I am, in the department where I am, we need to do more. We need to offer more education. And Lisa will be the first to admit that education is really the key to solving a lot of the issues that we have. So that's the first thing. The second thing is I wanted to give students and parents some specific tools for how to deal with this climate that we're in. You know, anti-Semitism is at an all-time high for sure, at least in our lifetime. And there are things that a lot of us are encountering in a regular basis that we might not have the words for, or we might not have a toolkit for how to deal with these things. So I want to offer a set of not only language, vocabulary, information, but resources, how to deal with things on and off campus, on social media, things like that. And last but not least, I want to offer a safe space for people to feel supported. You know, it's easy to feel very alone in this time in history, right? Even those of us that are out in the community helping, leading, it's easy to feel like, gosh, you know, we just don't have this support. And so I want to create a support network and let this be the beginning of a community, because this is how we create community. So without further ado, I want to number one say thank you so much for being here. And I want to give a huge shout to Lisa Biton, who's woken up at probably 4:30. She's in Israel right now. But without further ado, let me go ahead and edify the woman properly. Lisa Biton was born and raised in Northern California. She holds a BA in Classical Studies and European History from Santa Clara University and an MAT from USC. Lisa studied abroad at Ben Gurion University in Beersheba in 2005 and fell in love with the land of Israel and her Israeli husband. She made Aliyah in 2009 to the southern city of Kiryat Gat. Lisa has worked for AMHSI, Alexander Muss High School, since 2010 as both a general studies teacher and an Israeli studies teacher. Since 2022, Lisa has served as the Dean of Israel Studies, and we had a great podcast interview the other day, and I realized that she was the woman I was looking for to deliver this content. So without further ado, Lisa, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can give us a little history of the Holy Land and take us into the present.
Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for that introduction. It is 5 in the morning, so I will be as coherent as I can possibly be. But if I'm not, feel free to put questions or clarifications in the chat box. I don't know what the settings are. If you want to unmute yourself and you know, there's an ability to do that, I am happy to do that and answer questions. I also, as a teacher, I hate looking at blank screens and not having interaction. So if I ask questions, I'm looking for an answer. Feel free to put things in the chat box or unmute yourself and participate, because that's a big part of class to me, is that interaction and discussion. So I also want to just preface everything that what I'm going to be discussing today is a whole course, if not 15 courses. Basically, every aspect of what I'll be talking about could be a whole course in itself. You know, the War of Independence could be a whole course. The Yom Kippur could be a whole course. We're going to get through as much as we can get through. It'll be, a broad overview. I encourage you to, deep dive. I'm happy to recommend books, podcasts, anything that might help you deep dive into different sections. As Saul said, as a teacher, I think you can't discuss these things or argue these things or face challenges if you don't understand yourself what is going on. So the very first level of any sort of advocacy is knowing what you believe, right? Is knowing a kind of base of history, knowing what, your base core understanding is, and then being able to discuss it and deal with it. So that's kind of the goal of today. It's just giving you a brief overview. And I have, it's a mini PowerPoint. Oh, can you share my screen? Sorry, is that possible? It's just a brief PowerPoint that will show some images because again, do not, there we go. I think it is important. 1 second, find it. Okay. So one of the key questions that I always get when it comes to teaching about Israel is, where do you start, right? If we're going to talk about the land of Israel and the history of Israel and the creation of the modern state, do we start in 1948? The answer is we can't. That's already too late, right? There's so much history building up to it. And one of the main things I teach is that history doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? A lot of people ask me, or do we look at Jewish history as its own entity? The answer is no, you can't, because the Jews are impacted by the same influences as anyone else in the world. Now, it might be slightly different because we see the world in a different way, but we can't ignore things like the Enlightenment or things like the show. They exist, we exist in the same world as everybody else, right? So we have to see those same kind of impacts. So I tend to start in the Middle Ages or the early Renaissance, only because at some point I feel if you get too far back, no one's listening. If you start saying, oh, well, we were here in the biblical time and there was a Jewish state and Jewish leadership and Jewish kings, people say, yeah, that was thousands of years ago. No one cares. I think the Middle Ages are a time of such conflict that you kind of, I want to say, wipe the slate clean in when it comes to, country boundaries and movements of people. That, right, if you talk about the Crusades, it was a huge amount of people moving from state to state and country to country, and borders were shifting. The creation and the rise of Islam in, the 700s, these were huge periods of time and migration. Migration isn't a new thing. So I tend to start around the 1600s, also because this is a period of the rise of enlightenment. So we'll get to that in a second, but I kind of want to start with this map. So here we look at a map of about, late 1500s, and we're looking at the coverage basically post-Crusades, right? And here we are looking at Muslim control of the world. Now, you probably understand that Islam controlled much of, the Middle East and North Africa and all of that. What you might not have known if you haven't been in history class for a while is that they even knock on the door of Europe, right? They get to Vienna, they challenge these, European nations. It is a huge expansion of a nation, right? Now, one of the biggest problems when it comes to this kind of stuff is how do you control an area this large, especially back then, right? The Greeks, the Romans had all the same challenges. You can't, there's no phones, there's no planes, there's no cars. You can't control this kind of huge space in one way. So what they did is they broke it up into areas, right? They broke it up into chunks. And each area would have a different part of control, but I just want you to see that this is the overall large area of Muslim control in the Middle Ages. So if we look at the Middle East, Jerusalem specifically, we are basically under Muslim control at this point. Now, before I get to this slide, I will stop sharing 1 second. When we talk about the Enlightenment, right, we talk about the late 1600s, early 1700s. You guys might remember from your history classes that this is the time of, everyone's rethinking what it means to be human, right? What does it mean if we're going to be a person on this earth? I know that sounds kind of silly in today's day and age because I think that's all we think about, like, who are we as individuals? But that really wasn't part of the concept. And so when the Enlightenment kind of comes around, and again, doesn't exist in a bubble, there is a cycle of history. This comes in the back of the Reformation. It comes on the back of exploration. There are so many reasons why this is happening at this time. But people began to question, say, what does it mean to be a state? What kind of loyalty do I have to my rulers? What kind of loyalty do I have to my community? Right? What does it mean to be a person? Let's take America. What does it mean to be an American? Right? Even though America didn't exist back then, but is it language? Is it culture? Is it religion? Like what makes us us and what makes me me? And that really becomes kind of the central focus of the Enlightenment. And the Jews aren't immune to this, right? The Jews are part of this. And we see this in two important ways. One is that they begin to leave the ghetto, right? They begin to start saying, I don't want to be separate. I don't want to, exist in a bubble. And other people in the world also start having the same argument, right? What if Jews could be people? Which I know we think is a silly question, but was an actual question. We have writings from Napoleon. Napoleon brings in a Sanhedrin, right? He brings in a group of Jews to basically say, are you French or are you Jewish? And can you be both? And what does that mean? And he asked them questions like, if you get divorced, do you go to the French court or do you go to the Jewish courts? Right? If someone steals something, do you go to the Jewish police or the French police? Right? And where do these loyalties and boundaries lie? So the Jews are being asked these questions. They're having the same questions, just like everyone else is. And so they begin to move out of the ghetto. They begin to get more and more exposed to the world. So that's kind of step one, right? Step two is, again, if we're moving out of the world, then what does it mean to be a Jew? If we exist in the ghetto, that's really easy, right? We're all the same, but we have a strong community. We have a strong language. We don't interact much with the outsiders. It's easy to be Jewish when there is a defined set of criteria. And now we moved out of this community and we're amongst the wider world. And the question becomes, what does it mean now, right? What does it mean to be Jewish? If I keep Shabbat, does that make me Jewish? If I keep kosher, if I speak Yiddish, but not all Jews speak Yiddish, and there's really this question of what it means. And similar to a lot of countries and different to some is the question of a nationhood. What does it mean to have land? We don't have a country to call our own. And so this idea of Jewish nationalism didn't start with Herzl, right? We see it already in our Haggadah, right? That we returned to Jerusalem, and there were large scale nationalist movements, even in the Middle Ages. So kind of the biggest, Yehuda Anasi already in the 1500s already brings together a group of people to say, let's go to the Holy Land and take land back, right? Let's settle it. Let's make it our own. So we're already, in the Middle Ages, even before talking about this and having the same kind of discussion. There was this concept of Volk, right, of nationhood, of peoplehood, and that same word that's being thrown around, in Europe at this time of, what does it mean to be a German? What does it mean to be Italian? The Jews are having the same conversation. So when we get to the 1700s, 1800s, and this rise of the modern Zionism, it isn't in a bubble. It isn't new. We are simply acting like every other nation that's around us. And it's also important to state that Zionism isn't a monolithic thing, right? This is a huge black hole if you want to go down it, but I think people think that there's a Jewish state and that's Zionism, and that is what it is. But people had very strong feelings about what it means to be a state, right? Now, I don't know how many of you have ever gone down this whole in general of what it means to be a state, but the question becomes, do we want something that looks like America? Do we want a strong state with a government and it has to have our borders and we're going to have our own military? Or are we saying that we want a place of cultural, that we can go to, let's say at this time, the Arab state, and we can exist within it, and we are just going to have a cultural center that's going to express those views, right? Are we people who believe that we have to work the land? We have to change this image of a Jew, right? If you look at the Jewish image in the Middle Ages, let's be honest, like it's someone who sits at their desk and, has crunched over and is super, super white and has glasses because they're super nerdy, like the rest of us. Exactly. Is that the vision we want? Can we create a state like that? Or do we have to create a new Jew, right? Do we have to create something that's totally different? And there's some really great podcasts about these different figures, Jabotinsky and revisionism. You can go to A.D. Gordon and labor Zionism. Each one had very clear views on what a state should be, okay? So this isn't a simple idea thing, but we always go back to Herzl because Herzl is the guy who kind of got it off the ground, right? He's the guy who didn't sleep forever and basically worked himself to death, honestly, in order to get this statehood. Because when I teach this to students, we always ask them two questions. What do these people see as the problem and what was their solution, right? Why did Herzl think we needed Zionism? Because Herzl looked around at the world and said, anti-Semitism is rising, right? He existed in the modern world. He wasn't religious, right? He was a journalist. He was a writer. He existed in the modern world. He lived in modern cities. He spoke multiple languages, and he said, we need to be like every other nation. If we continue to exist like this, we're going to get destroyed. There's no way, we can go down the Dreyfus affair, right? He saw this anti-Semitism. He saw the pushback against the people. And he said, we need to create a modern political state, right? We need to present ourselves as a group of people who are going to build a nation that's going to sit on the same length as England and as Spain and as France. And we're going to be a political player in this issue. And so he went as a political representative. Literally, you can look at the map of his travels. He literally got on a train and just circled Europe for years and years and years and spoke to kings and queens and political leaders and just to talk about what it means to have a state, okay? And he got Jews together in Zionist conferences and said, let's talk about what this is going to look like so we can look, I mean, we can look professional, right? So that we look like we have our act together when we come in front of these people, and that we're going to have a government and we're going to have healthcare. And we're going to have, let's look at what that looks like. So we had these Zionist conferences, and the biggest, of course, is 1903. So by 1903, he's already been doing this for a while. He gets together a bunch of, Jewish leaders in Basel in Switzerland, and they say, what are we going to do what's this going to look like? Okay. And 1903 has been a really rough year for the Jews, this level of year, right? There's been a bunch of pogroms in Europe. Kishinev has been the biggest one. Again, if you have a black hole to go down to, there are fascinating writings on reactions to the Kishinev pogrom, of firsthand accounts of it. It was really a terrible, terrible event, right? A massacre. They destroyed, buildings and homes and stores, and it's a terrible story. And that really reverberated into the Jewish community, right? Because again, Kishinev is Eastern Europe, but it was a city, it was modern, like this can't happen in the modern world kind of thing. So there was this big push of, originally we had this idea, even, Herzl said, we're going to come back to the Holy Land. We're going to come back to Israel, to Palestine. We're going to settle this land, and this is going to be our land. And Herzl's starting to think, it's been a while. It's going to take a while because politics move slow. Maybe we should think about something else. Maybe we should, find a stopover, or, because again, for Herzl, the biggest problem was that we're in danger, right? This is anti-Semitism. And if that's the biggest problem, he says Israel doesn't matter, right? It's less important. That's stage 2. Stage 1 is to get safe, right? So he comes up with a bunch of plans using mostly the British Empire, and they suggest, what about Uganda? Uganda's a good idea. Anyone know where Uganda is on the map? It's in Africa. This is the 1800s. It's also England. No one's really asking the Ugandans if they care about this or not. That's not part of the discussion. Europe is expanding into Africa madly and taking over lots of different areas. So for the British, they're kind of like, hey, we'll put some, people we trust into Uganda. We'll settle them there, and then, we'll continue to expand. And Herzl said no at the beginning, but now he's starting to think, maybe this is the right thing to do, right? Maybe we need this place of safety. And we'll talk about Israel later. So he brings this up in the conversation in this conference, and he says, hey guys, how about we do Uganda? And as you can imagine, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, and hundreds of Jews sitting in a room with political leanings. It is highly divided, but the answer is pretty decisively no way. For a lot of different reasons. There was strongly the religious camp of Israel is the only place we're going to go. It's not just about being safe. It's about having our homeland. There were a lot of people who said, sure, we'd go to Uganda as a stopover, but we all know that once you get to a place and settle in, you never move again. Like that's just, nature, human nature. So we don't want to get stuck, bogged down in Africa. There were a couple people who were also like, what about the Ugandans? And, we're kind of like asking about the people there, which, shocker, was not part of the conversation. And the answer basically is no. Israel is just as important as this idea of being safe. We can't settle anywhere else. We have to keep our focus and our goal on going to the state of Israel. So Palestine at this point, it's part of the Ottoman Empire. It is controlled by an area that's basically Turkey, Syria, and it is Muslim. Again, it is a section, right? It's controlled by a governor of the larger Ottoman Empire, which again is a huge, huge, huge block of countries. The Ottoman Empire has had hit and miss relationship with Jews. On the one hand, they've actually invited them in because the Ottoman Empire is significantly missing a middle class. And so in a lot of places like Tzfat, they actually call the Jews and say, hey, come move to Tzfat because we need people like you who are going to improve the economy just a little bit, not too much, right? But bring up the lower class and stay away from the upper class, and also keep to yourselves and make money. So it works for everybody. So they've had this kind of hit and miss relationship. And so Jews have been moving into the Ottoman Empire for hundreds of years, right? Again, Tzfat in the Middle Ages, and by the time we get to the 1800s, people have already started to move into this area. And there is a period then of, as we lead up to World War I, this kind of world conflict, right? And then when we lead into World War I, everyone's trying to create alliances, right? That's a huge thing before World War I. It's actually where World War I starts, right? That everyone's trying to say, if heaven forbid we go to war, who's going to be our buddies? Who's going to be on our side to go against everybody else? We need the bigger block, right, than the other side. And that's what's going to help us win. So the Ottoman Empire has grown and grown and grown. They can't control themselves, and they are kind of a weak entity at this point, right? They're too large, too big for their britches, right? They can't really control themselves. And the Jews in the Ottoman Empire are kind of in a weird situation, right? The Jews exist at this point. They've already started moving there. And they have a big question. Do we side with the Ottomans or do we side with the British, right? Who is our better option? Again, if our goal is statehood and we're going to be like everybody else, on the one hand, the Ottomans control this land. So if we go against the Ottomans and they win, we've just shot ourselves in the foot, right? But if we side with the Ottomans and the British win, then we've totally lost any hope we have of having a nation, right? We've been doing all these dealings with them in the back, and now we've dealt that. For the most part, the Jews side with the British. For the most part, there are plenty of reasons about this. Again, this could be a whole class in itself about the Neely Underground movement, about Chaim Weizmann and acetone. There are Jewish brigades. If you ever come to Israel, there is a Anzac museum here in Beersheba that has a really cool history of the cavalry in Beersheba, which is a really unique story and situation. Don't want to get too much into World War I. That's a whole story in and of itself. But suffice to say, the Jews are siding with the British for the most part. And the British, every time they side with the people, they start making deals. And now there are lots of different deals. There's like Spicol, there's all sorts of different arguments. The one I'm going to put up as my next little slide is probably one you've probably seen, is the Balfour Declaration. Now, this is something that we tout a lot, right? The Balfour Declaration is proof of, Jewish statehood. I'm going to read it and then we're going to talk about it. So, dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Now, before we get in the text, let's start with the biggest question. Who's Lord Rothschild and who's writing it, right? Who are these people? There's a funny little thing right here that we don't have a government yet. And so if the British are talking about, and Herzl is dead by this point already, so, kind of the face of this, who do you write to? And the British kind of choose the wealthiest British person they could find, right? You're a Jew and you're wealthy and you have connections with the land. You're going to be our representative, right? We're going to, choose you. So Lord Rothschild, again, it's the Baking family. That's another black hole to go down in, is the Rothschild family and their connections in Europe. So they write this letter using him as the representation of the Jewish people and asking him to bring this letter back, okay? And this is a letter from the Foreign Office, from the British government. Now, it's not from the Prime Minister, right? We're not going that high, but it is official enough to represent the British government if we really try, right? So it's kind of like a mid-level officialness. Now, I'd be happy if you'd answer in the chat, or I don't know, you can respond to this. Reading this text, does anything stick out to you? Does anything seem particular, funny, interesting? If we're using this as a document of proof that we should have a state, right? What does this letter, the British are very good at their subtext, right? What does the letter actually say? I'll give you guys a second, or I never know how long to wait on these. I don't know, you can't see if people are typing.
I'm looking at the chat. The responses are not coming in yet, but take your best guess.
Okay. Just pick words, if anyone's done English homework, in a while. Okay, good. We view with favor, right? What does that mean? We view with favor. It's semi, it's positive, right? It's a good thing, but it's not exactly, yay. It's like, okay, we're mostly positive, so that's a good thing. Okay, a declaration of sympathy. Yeah, that's a good one, right? What does it mean to be sympathetic with a cause, right? It's kind of again, we agree and we're not super excited about it, but like we get that you have, some challenges that we're going to work with. Okay. Some other things I'll point out as you guys think. The establishment in Palestine of a national home. Now, what does it not say? Doesn't say a country, doesn't say a state, right? It says a national home in Palestine. So the point is that could be a state, right? Again, Palestine isn't the Palestine, it isn't Israel today, right? We're talking about from the river to the sea. That wasn't Palestine at this point. Palestine at this point, we'll look in a minute, is actually a much larger block of land, right? It's Transjordan, it's Israel, it's part of Separate, it's a huge chunk of land. So when we say in Palestine, clearly we're probably not talking about the whole thing, right? We're talking about a chunk of that land, and we're talking about a national home, which could be a state, but it could also be like a Haddam style. It could be a conglomeration of people within another state, right? It's not exactly clear, right? So that's one. We'll use their best endeavors. It's the most British thing I've ever heard, right? We'll try, probably, right? We can't promise, we will, you can't blame us if it doesn't work, right? We've tried, right? Okay. So those are our two big things. And then we continue, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in other countries. So there's two huge things here. One being, even the British are saying, there's a lot of non-Jews there. You have to acknowledge them. You can't ignore them. You can't put them second-class citizens. And it's true that in these conversations, most Zionist movements don't have them. I mean, it's fascinating. If you look at Jabotinsky, who everyone thinks is like the most right-wing, whatever, Jabotinsky talks about if we have a Jewish prime minister, the second in government has to be a Muslim or an Arab, right? That you have to have that balance in a Lebanon, government kind of way, right? So these discussions are already happening. That's not a problem. Fine. And then we continue the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. Now, it's interesting because what are the British really doing in this line? They're actually acknowledging anti-Semitism, right? They're basically saying they believe that if we create this Jewish home in Palestine, other countries are going to start kicking out their Jews. Other countries are going to start, saying, well, then go there, right? And they're trying to, negate that fact a little bit. So it's a really interesting letter. We throw it up all the time as, the reason for Jewish statehood. It's not exactly as clear and defined as maybe we would like, okay? So the World War I has ended by this point, and the question then becomes, what do we do next? Okay, and this is a question for the whole world because, again, Europe has been destroyed by this point. The Middle East has been destroyed. What does it look like to move forward to rebuild these countries? And again, the British have made a lot of agreements. They've made a Faisal-Weizmann agreement with the Muslims and the Jews in different groups. They've made this we just looked at, and they've made the Sykes-Picot Agreement, all of which talk about this specific area, the area of Palestine, in lots of different ways. And part of what they've done, I should mention, is that Faisal, who is the king of, we'd call it Iraq, I guess, has already made agreements with them about taking over part of this land of Palestine and expanding his reach. And there have been agreements with him and the Jews about what that would look like in the land of Palestine. At the end of the war, we create the League of Nations. Okay, and the League of Nations has one clear goal: peace on earth. Peace on earth. I know that sounds like a big draw, right? What does that mean to be peace on earth? Sorry, I just saw that. Balfour. Just so I explain who Balfour was. He was, again, a member of the British government, but he wasn't like the prime minister. He represented the British government in parliament. He had political power, but he wasn't, no, it wasn't anybody, but he wasn't like the highest levels of government. Sorry. So the League of Nations is created, and they're going to have peace on earth. And they actually create laws. My favorite law is the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which basically says war is illegal. We're not going to have war anymore, except for one little caveat: war is legal if you don't start it. Which Hitler will actually use to his advantage when Hitler starts World War II, which we'll get to. So their whole goal is to create peace on earth. And they look at this area of the Middle East. Again, the Ottoman Empire is falling apart. No one controls this area anymore. And they say, how do we make sure that war doesn't happen in this area? So they decide we're going to have this thing called the mandate system. Okay. And we're going to create 3 different mandates. And in each of these mandates, the goal is that the local people will become independent states, but they're not ready for it yet, right? The people of Syria aren't ready to have a country yet because, we're a bit whitewashed here, and we don't believe that anyone who's not white can, have a strong country. The Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I has disappeared, doesn't exist. Just before World War I, it was basically the map I showed you. It was a huge chunk of, North Africa into the Middle East. In 1918, when the war ends, the Ottoman Empire disbands, it falls apart, and it doesn't exist anymore. The closest little remaining piece of it would be considered Turkey, basically. So they create 3 mandates, and in each mandate, they basically say, the British or the French, depending on the mandate, are going to oversee this area with a clear goal of creating statehood. Okay. Now, this is my favorite game. I actually play this game with my students. It's called Who's Ready to Make a State? And we take Palestine as an example. So here you see in the bottom of your corner, this kind of orangey color called the British Mandate of Palestine, right? And we've already said that the goal is to create a Jewish state or a Jewish and an Arab state, right? They've acknowledged both. So if we're going to say we're ready for a state, how do we convince the British we're ready? What does it mean, right? Does it mean population? Does it mean infrastructure? Does it mean education? Does it mean healthcare? What does it mean? At what point do you say, I can create a state? I am officially ready to have everything I need to be a state. And we play this game, and I go through all the different Aliyah movements, and I go through the creation of the Histadrut, the unions, and the creation of the healthcare, and the creation of the railroads, all of which the Jews are doing, and the Arabs are also doing in different areas. And we talk about population increases, and we talk about, all these different things. And I'll give you a hint. When are we ever ready for a state? The answer is never. I always compare it to being a mom, to being a parent, right? You're never exactly ready. If you put things on paper and you mark down, am I mentally ready? Am I, emotionally healthy? Am I, financially ready? Am I physically? The answer is always going to be no. You're never exactly, it's never a perfect time. And the same thing happens in the Middle East. We don't exactly ever get there. But they do start sectioning things off. So if we look at this map, what do you notice about the British Mandate of Palestine, right? Again, we talk about the area of Palestine. Is that what you would think of as the area of Palestine? I know I'm asking leading questions to get an answer. Yeah, so it goes into Saudi Arabia. It includes what is today Jordan, right? This isn't just what we would consider Israel, or, even when they talk about Palestine today, okay? So it is a chunk of this land, okay? Already when we have 1921, this Faisal guy, remember we talked about him just a second ago, they break off and Britain gives half or 2/3 actually, if you look at this map, is kind of what creates the traditional Israel map. We cut off the area of Jordan and we make Transjordan, okay? And we give it to this family of Faisal, okay? Now, there's two things important to note. First of all, we just created Jordan out of Palestine. So if you ever meet someone who says, Palestine, we need all of Palestine, the answer is all of Palestine includes Jordan, right? On a very basic level. Second, this people he puts in power aren't actually from this area, right? They're much more Iraqi than they are anything in this area. So we talk about tribal issues. That is also going to be a problem in the future, okay? They are not local to this area. So already by 1921, this map of Palestine has changed. Now we're just looking at kind of the traditional map of Palestine, okay? So even in this traditional map of Palestine, the Muslims and the Jews, they both exist in this area. The Jewish population is expanding rapidly as people move in. The Muslim population is expanding a little bit less so, but it still outnumbers the Jews in most areas, okay, of this area of Israel. And the British are trying to figure out what to do to stop this fighting. Because again, the British are officially in charge at this point. It's the British mandate, right? So there's British, military sitting there. They're trying to keep the peace, and they do what we call the white paper cycle. Okay, so basically what happens is there's a cycle of violence and British reaction. So let's say there'll be the Hebron pogrom, right? Again, Arabs go and they massacre Jews in Hebron. Okay, the British, in response to this, will put out oh no, there's fighting going on, everyone stop. Okay, they put out this immediate letter, okay? And then they put out a white paper, which basically looks at the reasons for this fighting, okay? Why are all these fightings happening? And here I have an example of one in 1939, okay? So there's been fighting going on between the Jews and the Muslims, we acknowledge that, and they say, in order to stop this fighting, we need to create a Jewish and Muslim state, two different states, okay? It's not going to be just a Jewish state, okay? We're going to be given two different states, okay? That's one. Two, what's the biggest problem? This is always my favorite discussion. The biggest problem, why is there so much conflict? Is because too many Jews are moving in. That's a problem, right? Too many Jews is throwing off the balance of life, okay? It's upsetting the Arabs. The Arabs have a fear about Jews moving in, the Jews are moving in, and that's causing a lot of problems, okay? So we got to stop Jewish immigration. We have to focus on uplifting the Arab population, and that's going to make things better. So we're going to limit Jewish immigration to 75,000 people over the next 5 years. Those are good years, aren't they, right? 1940, 1945, okay? And we're going to create basically the beginning of these two states, a Jewish state, an Arab state, and this area. The British aren't going to give up Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, right? They're going to keep that little chunk of it. So here we have the map that they presented, okay? So as you can see, the Jewish state gets a smaller chunk, but, you know, more of the good stuff, and the Arabs get a much larger chunk based on where their population was, okay? Meanwhile, it's 1939. What happens? Subtle little things in the world. World War II breaks out, okay? World War II breaks out, and the question becomes, what do we do now, okay? And this comes on two levels. For the British don't have time to think about this anymore, right? The British are busy. They've got a war going on. And back to the same question that we had in World War I. Do we fight with the British, who are currently causing us huge headaches and not giving us a state? Or do we side with Germany, who might give us this? Okay, no, they're not going to give us a state. So the answer is really, there isn't really a second side, although we question it for a little bit because we don't really like the British at this point. And in fact, the quote comes out, they say, we're going to fight the British as if there is no war, and we're going to fight the war as if we're going to fight Hitler as if there is no mandate, right? So we're going to consider these two things separate bubbles in our head, right? On the one bubble, we have this issue of statehood, and we have the British who aren't giving us statehood. And in the other bubble, we have Hitler, which is a huge bubble. So we're going to, you know, keep those separate. We're not going to say we're going to join Hitler in order to get a state, because even in 1939, everyone realizes that's not a thing. That's not going to happen. So we have to kind of compartmentalize these two things and keep them separate. So World War II goes on. That nice 75,000 immigration number, we never get there. Even though we thought that was low, right? That was limiting us. Immigration basically stops during the war, as for obvious reasons. You know, there's a lot of, I don't have to get into World War II. That's a whole different class on the Shoah and discussion. But World War II ends, okay? It's 1945. And the question is, again, what now, okay? We still have this kind of archaic immigration policy. Again, it's from 1939 that, you know, 75,000 and, you know, that is basically over. So we've already limited our immigration. We don't want to do that anymore. But the Jews can't stay in Europe, right? They can't stay, honestly, in most of these African areas either. A lot of these Muslim countries also sided with Hitler. You know, you look at areas like Morocco. So there's a lot of chaos. People want to move, and their options basically are the US or Palestine. That's kind of all that's open. Again, if you ever want to go down the black hole of the Evian conference, right, where basically at the beginning of World War II, FDR got all the nations together and said, clearly something's going to happen to the Jews. This is going badly. And this was just in Germany at the time, right? It wasn't anywhere. Germany hadn't expanded anywhere else yet. And they say, who's going to take these German Jews, which was a small couple, like tens of thousands of people, right? It wasn't a huge population. And basically everyone said, yeah, no, we don't want to do that. We don't want to have immigration problems. You know, Australia literally said, we don't have a Jewish problem, a racial problem. We aren't desirous of importing one. This idea, right, that if Jews came to Australia, they would cause racial issues. You know, Brazil is like, sure, everyone come, but you have to be Catholic. Sorry, new rule. There's all sorts of fun ways that countries stop immigration. Even, you know, the Americans who call the conference are basically like, sure, we have our quota, you can fit it, but it's not just for Jews, it's for everybody. So everyone has to be equal. You know, we can't make exceptions. You know, there are 3 countries who do allow it, and they're always fun because they're countries that, like the Dominican Republic is like, sure, everyone come. For logistical reasons, that doesn't particularly happen. And so no one really wants large amounts of Jews to move into them, even after World War II, right? That's not an exciting look. But as we head into at the end of World War II, out of World War II, the League of Nations has fallen apart, right? What was their one goal? No more war. How well did that work out for them? Not so well. Hasn't worked. So they've fallen apart. And in their place, we've created the United Nations. New and improved League of Nations, new and improved. The biggest problem that they realized, or they thought, was that the League of Nations had no power. There was no military. There was no, like, all they could do was shake their finger at Hitler and say, you know, don't do that. That's not a good idea. So they created a United Nations, which in theory has a little more power. In theory, it has a standing force. In theory, it can, you know, make stronger political statements. So they get the UN together, and one of the first things they do is try to figure out this issue. Because look, it's 1945, 46. The British are also tired. Big part of World War II is that the British Empire is falling apart. No one wants, remember we talked about these nationalist movements? these nationalist movements have now caught on to the third world, right? And across the globe, in India, these countries are saying, we want nationalism too. We want to be independent. We deserve it just like you do. So the British are crumbling. They're trying to keep all their fingers and they're trying not to, kill everybody. So they basically turn to the UN and say, hey, we've kind of had enough. Can you tell us what to do, right? No one's ready for statehood yet. Figure out what we're going to do. So the UN sends a conglomerate of people from England, from different states, to, it's called UNSCOP, okay, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine. And they say, we're going to send this group of UN people to Palestine. They're going to walk around, they're going to see what's going on, and they're going to tell us what the best way to go is, okay? So they send this group there. Now, the point is, the Jews, Ben Gurion specifically, look around and say, we got to impress these people, right? This is the most important thing we've ever done is to impress these people. So Ben Gurion goes all out, right? And there's all sorts of fun stories of them planting flower beds in Tel Aviv, and then they unplant them and they rush ahead of the people and they replant them in a different city so that it looks like everywhere in, Israel is flowering and pretty, right? And they have the same, 20 kids driving around the bus, in the city, sneaking up and, oh, look at all the happy, shiny kids, they go all out to create this, vision of how much work the Jews have done. Meanwhile, the Muslim population is basically like, we don't got to impress nobody. This is our land, right? Who are you to come in and tell us what to do, right? We are who we are. We exist here. We live in large numbers. We've existed here for hundreds of years. Leave us alone. When they walk out of this, as you can imagine, UNSCOP suggests a solution. And this is their ideal. So this is their map, okay? They say we're going to have a two-state solution, okay? The yellowy orangey area here is going to be the Arab state, and the bluish area is going to be the Jewish state, okay? Now, anyone as I talk, anyone see a challenge with this map, perhaps? Anything that might, cause some issues? You can think about their, yeah, so one is Jerusalem. Jerusalem, again, the British like this area. They know it's going to be a conflict. So they basically, the UN kind of just whites that out. We'll talk about that later, right? Jerusalem will be a thing. Good. It's discontinuous. It doesn't connect, right? If you see this area of Gaza up into the West Bank, what does that mean? Is there going to be a road there? Is there going to be like a bridge and a tunnel and the Jews can go under and the Arabs can go over and that'll be easy? Okay, so why did they divide it this way? Basically, this is where they saw the majority of population. So they said in this area of Ramallah, it is mostly Muslim, right? And therefore, it makes sense to put the Muslims there, okay? In this area of Haifa, in this area of the Rothschild area, they've created vineyards up. If you've ever been to Zichron Yaakov, there's mostly Jews. So then we're going to put the Jews there. Okay, so that's kind of how they divide it up for the most part. You notice the Jews get most of the desert. And that is very specific for Ben Gurion, because Ben Gurion felt the only way we're going to survive is if we have this huge buffer zone between us and everybody else. And that's basically what the desert is. Okay, so this was their idea. Okay, they put this out for a plan and they go in front of the UN and the Jews are like, yes, we accept this wholeheartedly. Now, what was Ben Gurion's most underlying answer, right? Is this what he wanted, this map? No, right? He wanted the whole thing. This was not what he wanted. But Ben Gurion was a politician above everything else. And Ben Gurion basically said, we know as politicians, we have to accept the map on the ground because how accurate are these lines going to be on day 2 of statehood? The answer is they're not. Maps don't matter. Lines drawn by nations don't matter. What matters in the end is war. And Ben Gurion says he knows what's going to happen, right? We're going to accept this map. We're going to announce this map on day 1. On day 2, there's going to be a war. And what matters is what happens at the end of that war. That's what matters. Those are the true lines of Israel. So he says, let's accept this. Because again, this is back to the UNSCOP thing. We want to be seen as part of this discussion. We want to be at the table. We want to be in the room where it happens, right? To quote Hamilton, we want to be a part of this discussion. And the only way to do that is to accept it. So that's what we're going to do. So they accept it. And the Arab countries are basically like, again, the Arab people there, nope, right? This doesn't work for us. We don't particularly like it. We want the whole thing and, leave us alone. So it still goes to the UN and UN Resolution 181, right? So if we look at pure numbers, there's also a slight issue here. Jews get just about half the land, even a little bit more than half the land, something about 56% of this land. Again, we call it of Palestine, we get 56% of Palestine, but we've already lost 2/3 of Palestine to Jordan. So, our math is funny math at this point. We're going to get just over half it. The Jews are about 1/3 of the population. But again, if you look at it, most of this land, the southern part, is hardly occupied or is occupied by nomadic tribes, which is a whole different, the Bedouin are a whole different discussion because they aren't Jewish, but they are nomadic. What does that mean about land holding? That's a much stronger challenge. So this goes in front of a vote at the UN because again, the Jews have said, sure, let's do it. So the UN says, we're going to make a decision, and it goes in front of the UN. There's whole filibusters in the UN. They use Thanksgiving to try to get a couple votes. They basically close down the UN. They start talking and never stop until Thanksgiving happens, and they have to go, the next week. So they finally go in front of the UN. They give a vote, and the UN says it passes. Right now, it's not like a whole 100%. It is a very simple, sure, right? Most of us say yes. And I will get back 1 second to the malaria, but here's a map of basically who says yes and who says no and who says kind of we abstain. So you can see, it's always interesting that Russia and the US actually agree at this point. Again, this is 1947, 1948. So why would that be a thing? But even in this point, they do agree. The Cold War is going to have a huge impact on this in a minute, but not exactly at this point. As you can see, all these Arab nations are like, hell no, we don't, this isn't happening. And they do vote in these, but that's kind of the map. I'll just side note for a second, because Saul asked about this map. So part of this early Zionist movements was about working the land. And there was this feeling that one of the things that makes us a country is controlling land. And Jews haven't done that, right? Jews, for the most part, have been bankers and lawyers and doctors. And, we've sat in our buildings, but we haven't physically touched the land. And that makes us different. And if we want to move to this new land and we want to control it, then we have to work it. And the early Jews that moved in this area, they weren't given the best of the best, right? No one wanted to give them central Jerusalem land, right? No one wanted to give them land on in Haifa, where they had been big cities, or in Akko, right? And these traditional cities, or in kind of Yaffo area. Instead, they got the areas that no one really wanted, and people laughed at us. So we got the areas in the desert, and we got the areas in the marshes, right? If you've ever been in the north of Israel, not today, but if you can read Mark Twain, visited Israel or Palestine, he did a world cruise. It's a fascinating book called Innocents Abroad. He wrote about his travels around the world in the 1800s. He came here and he basically said, Israel's one of two things. It is either a desolate wasteland of desert, or it is marshy swampland. And either way, it's ugly and depressing, and no one should ever live here, is basically his response. And there's a whole chapter he has based on that. And so the Jews come in and they start, and this is actually, where Ben Gurion comes in. He changes his name, right? Becomes, kind of this new Jew, works the land, and they create their own defense and their own language. And again, this becomes back to, what does it mean to be a nation? This is when Hebrew becomes a modern language, right? Because they say, if we're going to be a nation, we have to have our own language. We can't just, be anything else. And there's a whole argument about, Yiddish, but Yiddish isn't, the real language. We have to have our own core language, and we're going to bring back Hebrew. And we start thinking about, what does it mean to have a word for car, right, in Hebrew, and how do we, use those things? So it changes your mindset already. And the same thing, if we're going to have our land, we're going to work the land, we just said, but we don't have any security system. We rely on Arabs for safety, right? For our guards, for our land. That goes counterintuitive to everything. So we start Shomer Hadash, right? We start these organizations that train Jews to fight, basically, right? Back already in the 1800s. And so they start working the land, they start draining the swamps, they start, really working on the land to make it a livable land. Malaria is terrible. There's actually fascinating readings. Rachel the poet, Ben Gurion himself, they write about first coming to the land, and that malaria was just like part of the deal, right? You would basically go half a month and you would have sweats and fevers, and then you'd get up and go back to work. And that was just like, they were ready to work. And that was what part of how they made the land. And it wasn't a question, right, whether or not to do it, because this was such a clear vision for them. So we have this land, and again, just as Ben-Gurion said, the second that this is agreed, war breaks out. Ben-Gurion knew what was happening, okay? And we have this new Jewish state, and we have every country around it saying, yeah, no, this isn't happening. We're going to fight you. You know, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, everyone is getting involved, and everyone wants a piece of the pie. Now, there are phases of the war, and it is important because pre-statehood, okay? So we just said that November 1947 is when the UN makes this decision, okay? But statehood, we know, doesn't happen until May 1948, okay? So what happens in those first, I can't do math, 6 months, right? Those first 6 months are just internal fighting because Jordan knows they can't wander into the British mandate, which it still is, and start a war, because that would be a war against the British. We don't want to do that. So they come in and they don't come in, the local people are starting to fight. There are internal battles at the beginning, right? It's only in 1948 in May when we make the announcement of statehood, right? When we pick a name, we call ourselves Israel, and we now have taken over the government, that these other nations come in and begin to fight, okay? So there's kind of phases of the war, right? There's an internal phase, and then there's a phase when the other Arab states come in to fight, okay? There is also in the middle, there's 2 ceasefires that the British managed to deal out, and then it kind of changes the shape of the war. Now, one of the big things in any war, and we actually see this in our current conflict with Gaza, the smaller side isn't always, I mean, we talk about David and Goliath, and there's actually a fascinating book about David and Goliath, and I'm blanking on the author's name, but I'll think about it in a minute, that says that David, although we think of him as, you know, the weaker one, the smaller one, in some cases, that's actually a benefit. They're actually more likely to win. And we look at this in things like the American War of Independence, right? Because the British, let's take the American War of Independence. The British needed to, what did they have to do to win the war? They had to destroy all the Americans hanging out in America and build up a new government, whereas the Americans just had to stay, right? They had to not lose the war. And the Jewish population here is kind of the same. If we just don't lose, we've kind of won, right? If we don't leave, then we still exist. So that's kind of their main goal, is just to hold on as much as possible. And again, to find borders or to expand in certain areas to try to create a country that we could possibly live in. The Arabs are also they think too highly of themselves, and they come in thinking we're just going to destroy them. It's going to be super easy. Anytime they meet with actual resistance, they kind of fall apart. But the war goes on, and Ben-Gurion says a couple of major things. One is that we have to get Jerusalem. That is number one for Ben-Gurion. Ben-Gurion says, we saw what happened with Herzl and Uganda. Not having Jerusalem would do the same thing to the Jewish people. Okay, so we need to get Jerusalem basically at all costs necessary. Now, Jerusalem, one of the reasons why it's been so popular for so long is that it has everything going for it. It has an underground water source. It has a lot of mountains. It's really difficult to get to. There's basically one road in and one road out. So if you control Jerusalem, you control everything. And so we spend a huge amount of people and resources getting to Jerusalem and breaking that barrier. There, again, fascinating research. You can go into this on the Burma Road. There's a movie about Mickey Marcus called Cast a Giant Shadow that I recommend that you watch. Again, it's back from 60s or 70s, but they spend a lot of time focusing on Jerusalem. Numbers. If you look at the numbers, those numbers are the population pieces of the army, right? So the number of Egyptians, Iraqis, Syrians, the Arab legions that are attacking into Israel, they are large numbers. Again, if you look at Sahel, numbers aren't exact, but we've got 28,000, 25,000 on a good day. So you can see number-wise, we are at a huge disadvantage. But again, we don't have to win. We just have to lose. So we have to not lose. We don't have to win. We just have to not lose. The other thing is that a lot of these soldiers are people right off the boat from concentration camps. Like, people would come off the boat. They're settling in this area now in 1947, 1948. They've been in deportation camps and displaced Persian camps, and they get put here and they literally walk off the boat in their, clothes that they've been sleeping in for months and months and months. They get handed a gun and are basically like, good for it. There's actually a piece in Cast a Giant Shadow where they talk about They didn't have markings for the officers, so they would tie red ribbons, and then they could just untie the ribbon and tie a red ribbon on somebody else when they fell in battle, and they would just basically like go, down the line and pass this ribbon of leadership down as people just died in front of them. If you ever go to Mount Herzl, there is a whole section of Mount Herzl, a monument dedicated just to those lost that were the only member to survive the Holocaust. So these people who came from the Holocaust, who their whole family tree was cut down, they came here as lone soldiers, lone people. They went right to war and died in the first year, basically. So there's a whole monument and names of those people. And those are the only ones we know, right? Because I'm sure there are people that were passed in those areas and and didn't. So it's not like we're talking about like a highly trained fighting force, right? For most of it, this is not a high level. Yeah, there's a question here that UNSCOP, they must have known this was going to happen. Truth is, at this point, everyone's just kind of tired. The British are tired. They don't really want to deal with this anymore. They are too, again, stretched out. They got India creating independence at this point. They got Africa falling apart. They, things aren't good. Their whole, let's be honest, World War II physically destroyed all of Europe, right? The bombings of southern England, all of, mainland Europe has been just torn apart, right? Not enough food, no one has the time for this, honestly. So they just say, you guys duke it out, right? We've done our political part. We put things on paper and then good luck, right? There also is a little bit of this, political hubrisy of, we put a map. Of course, you'll follow the map. It's on a map. There's a whole joke Eddie Izzard does about flags, right? You put a flag down, clearly it's ours now, even if people lived here before. So that's a huge part of it. It's just this sense that it happens. Okay, so now we're at the end of the war, and this is our new map, okay? The Jews have actually done really, really well for themselves when the line ends, okay? We don't have the Gaza Strip. We don't have this little chunk along the line with Egypt of Sinai. We don't have what is called the West Bank, right? It's called the West Bank, even though it's on the eastern side of Israel, because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River, okay? We have half of Jerusalem, which is pretty good, and the road leading up to Jerusalem, which is also very good. And this is good enough for basically the Jews, right? Like, we've gotten more land than we did before, and then we have to go. I do know I've been talking a while. We're coming up on an hour. I'm happy to keep talking. I'm happy to do a second class at some point, or I can kind of skip to the end and kind of I just want to show one more image. Then if we're just going to I'll talk about this and then I'll type up one more image and then I'll cut off. That's okay. I'll talk about two more things.
Okay.
Okay. And I know I get excited. There's too much to talk about, too many things.
That's
one of the big issues becomes the refugee population. Okay. So we have in the world, we have the UNHCR. The UNHCR is the UN refugee population. So this gets created after World War II. Again, after World War II, there are millions of refugees, right? Not just the Jews. Everyone's been displaced. What do we do about this? And so they say, we're going to create this organization that's going to help refugees. Now, I want you to think for a second, what does it mean? What defines a refugee, right? That is the most important question. What defines a refugee? So they say a refugee is someone who is fleeing persecution for some reason, whether it's race, religion, nationality. They can no longer live in their home country, okay? That's important. What makes someone not a refugee then? If you are a refugee, right? I am a survivor of the Holocaust and I have fled and I can no longer go back home because there's pogroms happening in Poland. I go to America. What makes me not a refugee anymore is basically the second I get a citizenship somewhere else. I now hold an American passport. I am no longer a refugee because I'm not in danger anymore, right? I got all the rights of a citizen somewhere else, okay? So that is an important thing. Or, Ireland, everything's peaceful in Ireland and I can go back home now and then I'm no longer a refugee either, right? Those are the two options. In 1947, suddenly we have, there are Palestinian refugees, right? There's hundreds of thousands of them that leave or flee. There's all sorts of numbers about how many left willingly, how many fled as course of war, how many were physically kicked out of their homes. That's a whole different discussion we can get into. But the UN basically gets together and say, we're going to create UNRWA. We're going to create an organization that is just for Palestinian refugees. Okay, it's a separate organization. No other refugee organization is like this, right? The only other refugee organization is for everybody. And then you got the Palestinians. And they say, what makes a Palestinian refugee? A Palestinian refugee is someone who is a descendant of someone who was kicked out of Israel. That's too simple, but that's the basic idea, right? So that means that Gigi, the model, she is a Palestinian refugee, right? Gigi Hadid. Her father is a Palestinian refugee. She's a child of a Palestinian refugee, and therefore she is a Palestinian refugee. Forget the fact that she holds multiple citizenships. Forget the fact that she is wealthy as all hell. She is still a Palestinian refugee, and there's no way to not be a Palestinian refugee. You can't ever lose this, okay? It doesn't matter if you get citizenship. It doesn't matter if you go anywhere else. That means that the population of Palestinian refugees is continually growing, okay? So again, we had hundreds of thousands at the beginning. Now we're up to millions, okay? Now, part of the problem is these refugees count from everybody from the people currently starving in Gaza to those in refugee camps in Jordan, under Jordanian control, to those sitting in mansions in Beverly Hills. Okay, they're all considered Palestinian refugees as part of that number. Okay, so that's a huge thing you might hear about. I'm going to skip to the rest of it to modern day, but this might be a map you see a lot, right? This is often shown as an example of how the Jews are taking over the world. Okay, look, we had this Arab state, right? And then the Jews took over and took over and took over and squished this orange, Palestinian state into nothing. Okay, except for, and again, we didn't talk about all this map. This map it's a false truth. Okay, let's take the first picture. This orange, that orange map on the far left never existed. Okay, there was never a time when just this land of Palestine was just an independent state of Palestine. Again, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and then it was part of the British Mandate, and then that was also part of Jordan. This never existed. Okay, that's step one. Now, step two is the map we've seen, right? We've seen that map, so we agree with that map. That map existed, but again, that map existed on paper, okay? That was a map that never actually, it lasted one day in the real world, right? And then there was a war. And again, we didn't start the war. We said yes, and we sat down, and then we were invaded, and then we fought back. And that's kind of the rules of war, right? Whoever kind of gains the land and gains the land. And that gets us to map number three. Map number three is the map that actually kind of existed on paper. So this is the first map that we can look at and say, yes, this is a map that existed and that we have worked with, right? And then we go to map number four. And map number four, you see now the West Bank is all pockety, right? That's the Oslo Accords, which, is a whole different discussion in and of itself that I won't get into and happy to do a different class on at some point. It kind of means that we're only talking about map number four if map number three isn't exact, because map number three, it's not that everyone in map number three was an Arab and that suddenly we've invaded. Again, there's the 1967 war. We've now had another war. Again, we've been invaded. We've been challenged. There's a whole, other things there. And then you'll get, apparently there's a separate class on that. So you'll get a class on the 1967 war and you'll learn more about that. Again, we've taken over, but it's not really through any fault of our own, right? And these potholes are Jewish populations. They're not the ABC, and what it looks like today is not exactly clear, right? So it is important that when you see these maps, people throw this out as look how the Jews have taken over and kicked out all the Arabs. They're just not accurate maps. They don't represent anything that has ever existed on the ground, okay? I know I talked a lot. I've talked for an hour. I'm happy to answer any questions. Again, this is just a very beginning of the foundation of our state. When it comes to current boundaries, things like the disengagement from Gaza, things like 1967, they also have an impact on the current situation and what it looks like today. So they're also important to get to at some point. So I encourage you to keep coming to these other classes and learning other things, but I'm happy to answer any questions if there are.
You can type your questions into the chat, and thank you. That was amazing. I mean, that was a great history from, I think you started with a slide from mid 1500s. We got to 67. That was very impressive. Okay. All right. When are the rest of the classes? It'll be Thursdays moving forward. So I definitely want you to address one other topic, which I know that you're an expert on, and something that I want to really just take a little bit more of your time, which is just some tools for college students to deal with the current climate. I know that you deal with high school students, but it's the same, really. It's the same set of tools. And I'm sure a lot of you that jumped on here didn't expect to get such a thorough history lesson. So I told you she was going to be good. And she has a lot more to offer as well. So I think if we can convince her to get up early again, maybe we'll have to send her some espresso or something. Maybe we can do another class. But maybe you can talk about, there's really three things that you mentioned on the podcast. I want you to just, in 5 minutes or less, debunk the genocide, apartheid, white colonialist state narrative, those three things. And then any tools or really ways of thinking or being or things that you offer the high school students that you think would be valuable to college kids that hear this, college students, and also their parents?
So the big three things that you might hear nowadays: genocide, right? That Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza. Um, I hate to say it as simply as this, but we're not. And that doesn't mean, and I think this is the biggest thing, and I always say this as a Californian, as much as living in Israel has changed my politics, I am always a bleeding heart San Franciscan. That is just who I am at my very base. I don't want to negate those who are suffering in Gaza. There is starvation going on in Gaza. There are people dying in Gaza. That is for sure. And Had Mashmait, I don't know how to say that in English, absolutely a thing. Okay, I don't, and I think there's this thing when you get pro-Palestinian people, well, you say there isn't genocide, therefore, you're saying that no one's dying. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying no one's dying. That is a fact on the ground we can't ignore. What I am saying is that there is no nationally organized military law that says that we are going out and we are massacring civilians and we are killing people and we are taking away their food on purpose and we are bombing the hell out of buildings where we know people are. That is not happening. I have a brother-in-law who is high up in the Israeli army. I know how he fights and what his goals are. I know the risks he takes at the life of his own soldiers in order to protect civilians. That again can be a whole different class in of itself, but people want to make things black and white. Right? They want to say it's either a genocide or nothing's happening. That's just not the case. It is a complicated piece of war, and in war, bad things happen. And Gaza is a very, very small urban population. That means that if we're going to fight it, it means that we are fighting in urban areas. It means that civilians are there. And as much as we try to do that, we're not going to be perfect. The issue of getting supplies in, again, if you've seen some of these videos, it's not so easy. It's not that we can just drive these in and give them to civilian populations. First and foremost, we have seen Hamas militants in hospitals, in these civilian camps. They are there. They are fighting there. They are hiding there. Hamas is even limiting the amount of food that others are getting. Right. So that is a huge part of it. Sorry, what were the other two? That was one.
No, and I will add, I listen to the Israeli, army debrief every day, and every day they say these are the amount of trucks that went in, and I think yesterday it was like 270 trucks, thousands of pounds of food, and every single day they say there is no limit to the amount of aid we can send in, and we're not limiting it at all. So just wanted to add that as well. And also, if just one side note, if you want to look at what genocide looks like, there's plenty of examples, and it's just to put it very simply, it's when you reduce a population drastically. If you looked at the numbers, I think it's the population of Gaza doubled since 2005. And since, if you count the refugee count, it's from 50,000 to 5 million. If you look at a country like, let's say, Yemen, 400,000 people killed there in recent years. I would call that a genocide, but the world isn't. Syria, civil war, almost 500,000 people were killed. One might call that a genocide. And there's plenty of other examples in which tens of hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And it's unfortunate. People die in war. So we don't want to diminish the fact that people have died and people are dying, right? But it's just important to clarify. So when you are out there hearing these words in the world, that you know what the terms mean and that you have some other reference points. That's why I wanted to talk about that.
And if you ever want to go down the black hole of Houthis, like you might have seen this in the news, they're not necessarily the good guys. They themselves are part of Saudi Arabia, so that's a whole similar path to go down.
Yeah. Okay. So apartheid state and then white colonial state. Those are the other two things.
So apartheid. Apartheid has a very clear definition, and this is one of those ones that always just bugs me because we have Arab Muslims in our government. They sit in our parliament. They sit in our local cities. There's actually a really fascinating woman, Palestinian woman that just ran for mayor of Jerusalem. I recommend that I'll find her name and I can send it to you guys out after. They live amongst us. That sounds terrible. Like they have equal rights as citizens. If you ever go watch Nas Daily, I recommend Nas Daily. He's a popular social media person. He has a whole blog he did on what it means to him to be a Palestinian Israeli. I recommend that you watch that. It's just not true. What people tend to throw at us is, well, the people in Gaza can't vote. Yeah, because non-citizens can't vote. And citizenship was given to the Arabs that stayed in this area. We don't control Gaza. We left Gaza in 2005. They have their own government called Hamas. That's where they vote in theory. They don't get two governments. They don't get to vote in Israel, right? Because they have their own entity. So people who are citizens of Israel can vote and they can be prime minister. And they, again, I don't know if they would from population wise, but in theory, right, there's nothing holding against it. I think I mentioned this on, maybe I mentioned on the podcast that I was talking to a friend of mine who's Turkish that was saying that the Jews can't be policemen in Turkey. It's not allowed, right? That doesn't exist in Israel. Anyone can be. There are Muslims. They don't have to serve in our army, but they are able to, right? The Druze population serves in our army. That's just not true. Like, there's no other way to argue it. They sit in our government, therefore there's no apartheid.
And also, one thing I want to mention as well, seeing as it's Ramadan in a few days, freedom of religious expression, right? The other thing that they said on the announcement this morning is they're going to make sure that Muslims can go and freely observe Ramadan at the Dome of the Rock. That's a huge deal. Jews can't, just for example, Jews can't go and pray in Gaza freely. That would not be it. That wouldn't work out very well, right? So, and same with Christians and Baha'is and Druze and other faiths. They can all celebrate and worship in their way freely, and that's doesn't happen in an apartheid state. Okay, last one is the white colonialist narrative.
Yeah, so I always joke about this because if you look at the population of Israel, my husband's Moroccan. He is not a white colonizer, and as much people say, people like me, Americans, Europeans who have come in from Poland, have come in to, destroy the local populations. Again, most of the population is not white, as difficult of a term that is and what that means. Most of the population is from North Africa or Ethiopia or India. I don't know the exact numbers, but it's more than 50% of the population is not Ashkenazi, is not white. So that's a very simple fact. And the other fact being that, again, even if you call us white, we aren't in the traditional definition, right? In all of these populations, again, you can go back to the 1950s in the US, right? No Jews, no blacks, no dogs, right? You see these things at pools. We've always been treated as a minority population. We also have, a different genetic system. We have not come into this area from outside. Again, we didn't go back all the way into the ancient world. We have roots in this land. We have genetics in this land. Even those of us who are, white, quote unquote, we have not colonized it. And again, you've just seen the path of history and war of our ties to the land, even just in the modern ages.
Yeah, I would add to the way I like to look at Israel is really a successful decolonization. We decolonized it from the British, and it's another nice way. That's a real Bay Area term. It's a back to the land movement. It's an indigenous peoples back to the land movement, right? So, okay, thank you so much. If you would just take like a little more, maybe 5-10 minutes, anything that you like to tell students around just how to deal with anti-Semitism on and off campus, anything that you suggest, things that you teach your students. We'd love to hear that.
So the first thing I always say, which I think surprises people, is something that I learned when I was at college in the Bay Area during the Intifada. Again, I went to a Catholic university. There was a lot of, in general, we always avoided UC Berkeley. We always knew UC Berkeley was a problem place. UC Irvine, right, these places. And the concept I was taught was called sinners, saints, and salvageables. Now, it comes off harsher than perhaps it is, but I think it's a really important thing for college kids to keep in mind, or anybody, but especially college kids. In any given argument, there are the sinners, saints, and the salvageables. Now, what does that mean? Let's take abortion, everyone's favorite topic. Let's put Israel aside for a second, okay? Let's say that you are pro-choice, okay? You believe strongly in being pro-choice. You believe everyone who's pro-life is nuts, right? You have strong feelings about this. When you go out in the world, you'll meet people who are saints. They're people who are also pro-choice. Whatever you say, they're gonna nod, they're gonna smile, they're gonna be like, yeah, you're totally right, right? Anything, because they agree with you, they're on your side, okay? And then there are the sinners. The sinners are the people who are pro-life. They say whatever you say, whatever logical argument you build, they don't care because they have a belief system and they follow it and they will stick to it no matter what, okay? And then there's the salvageables. The salvageables are people who know nothing or they don't care. Now, if you ask them straight out, are they pro-life or pro-choice, they might come up with something, but they've never thought about it more than 2 seconds in their life, right? They don't, it's not something that they feel passionate about. And in any given argument, the sinners and the saints are 10% of the population, maybe 20, okay? In any subject, okay? This 80% of the population that are salvageables, most of the population, even on Israel and Palestine, if you look at Israel and Palestine, you look at the news right now, you would think that everyone all over the world is constantly thinking about Israel and Palestine, is constantly thinking about Gaza. Truth is, no one's thinking about Gaza. I mean, that's not true, but 20% of the population is thinking about it. Everybody else is going about their daily life and just not caring because they have taxes to pay and they have traffic to sit through and they have a job to go through, okay? Now, why is this important? It means that if you are in any situation, and there's a really amazing video I recommend with Nir Barkat at San Francisco. I think it was San Francisco State, but I might be wrong on that. I can send the video to Saul and he can send it out if you want, in which Nir Barkat goes to speak to a group of students in San Francisco. And he's speaking, and as he's speaking, this group of pro-Palestinian protesters come in the room and start screaming, chanting, yelling things, throwing things. And Nir Barkat does exactly what I could never do. He looks everyone in the eye. He gets the people he's listening to closer and closer and closer. He lowers his voice. He stays calm and he continues his conversation. And you know what happens to the past? They get worse and worse and louder and louder and louder. And he just continues his conversation because what does he know? He knows that if he interacts with them, he's only doing himself harm. Because what's going to come out is a video of him screaming at the pro-Palestinian group. And then he's going to be seen as the crazy guy, right? We like to use this word hysterical, right? You know, these crazy women, you know, screaming their heads off, that kind of image, okay? If he stays calm, then he doesn't feed them anything. And if he does yell at them, he's not going to convince them. There's nothing he can do in that situation that's going to change their minds. So the only people's minds he's trying to connect to are the people he's talking to who are listening to him and the people who are going to watch the video after who are not part of this conversation, okay? And this is a really, really hard thing to do, okay? This is something that it's not an easy thing. But the point is that you need to know when to engage and when to just walk away. And if you go, I mean, like the guy who died in Southern California, you can be at risk. You can be at risk physically, you can be at risk mentally. You can't get into every Facebook argument. It doesn't work, right? You will drive yourself crazy. So you need to know when to engage, exactly, when to engage and when to walk away. And knowing that boundary, and again, we all make mistakes, so at some point something's going to get under your skin and you're going to, you know, flip out because they said, you know, apartheid, and that really sticks to you and that will set you off. But you need to know that your goal, if you want to be a pro-Israel advocate, whatever that means to you, is to speak to those who are open, right? You can give any facts to these people protesting in London who are, you know, putting up pictures of Jewish stars in trash cans and talking about throwing out the trash. You will not convince that person of anything in that moment. There is nothing you can say, okay? So don't do it, okay? And I know a lot of people question that for me because they say, well, you are, you know, a pro-Israel advocate. You should be talking about, like, you know, it belongs in the place it belongs. And especially for high school kids and especially for college kids, I don't want anyone to put themselves in a place of physical danger in order to prove a point. Okay, and that's most important for me. And that probably wasn't like the key address of, you know, how to be a pro-Israel advocate, but to me, that's a very important part. That, and then I do strongly believe, again, in knowledge, I think that everyone should continue to take classes, ask questions. I think we talked about this in our podcast, right? That if anyone says anything, especially let's say in a college classroom, a professor says something that you know or believe isn't true, I know it's difficult, but that is a place where you can raise your hand and say, I don't, and again, a college classroom should be a safe space. And if it's not, then you should have the board behind you. You do have ADL, you do have resources to turn to and say, I said this and it wasn't a safe space. So I mean, I use this example in the podcast, right? I had, you know, college professors tell me that no one kept kosher, which again, isn't a pro-Israel argument or not, but I was able to raise my hand and say, that's just not true. Let's have a discussion about that, right? If someone in a college classroom, you know, if a teacher is teaching about apartheid and uses Israel as an example, you can raise your hand and say, can you give me a specific example? Can I give you an example, right? I know that there are Muslim members of Knesset, right? And so that should be a place where you can raise your hand and ask those questions, again, in spaces that you feel that you have support. But do know that there are lots of organizations, whether or not it's in your university itself, but organizations like ADL, your Hillels are often good resources for this to go to. They have outside support. Your Chabadniks, even though they don't tend to deal with politics, they do have good support. They know resources to hand out. So do feel free to raise your hand in those kind of situations and ask and push back. I was just using an example of one of my students is actually now fighting in Gaza. Ironically enough, his father is now my boss, so it's a full circle. But he was in a university campus in Wisconsin, and he noticed a pro-Palestinian sticker on someone's laptop. And he asked them about it, and they've actually had a really good dialogue about the conflict. So don't be afraid to ask and push back on those things, as long as it's not a situation. I've been talking a lot. I'll probably cut it off there, but I do appreciate everyone for listening. I do believe there's a recording. I'm taking off a solid job here. I'm also happy to send out the PowerPoint, although I don't believe it's anything groundbreaking, but I'm happy to share that also.
Okay, Lisa, thank you so much. You have absolutely over delivered. Please give her some thank yous and shout outs in the chat. And I will definitely make this recording available. And I think Lisa offered her email if you want to ask questions. And I definitely, more Torah, more education. That is really a great place to turn to in these times to get more information. And just to, as my dad would say, the best defense in a fight is don't be there. And also, you want to know your audience, right? You always want to know your audience, who you're talking to. So, with that being said, I want to wish everyone Erev Tov, early Shabbat Shalom. Thank you for coming to the first of our 6-part series. And Lisa, thank you so much for your time. And we wish you a good day. And we'll see you soon.
Can I plug the end by saying, listen to our podcast?
Oh, yeah, this is a podcast. It just came out. It sounds great.